Did you know that in a best case scenario, the US housing market is underbuilt by a whopping 2.5 million housing units? And in a worst case scenario, we're underbuilt by 7+ million. That alone shows such a huge imbalance between supply and demand, which in a sense answers why real estate prices have been skyrocketing over the last few years. But in just over a month, we're going to have a new president. And one of the big questions on everyone's mind is, how is this going to affect the real estate market? Because this president has promised to bring down the prices of pretty much everything. Whether that's going to be able to be accomplished is another question entirely. But in today's video, I want to focus on the real estate market and the likely impacts of his policy proposals. And I'm also going to talk about general real estate trends, of course, based on data, and I'm going to cover mortgages. What can we expect over the next 12 months? So with that said, as always, my name is Derek, and I got my degree in finance, so you don't have to. Let's get right into it. So let's start with Trump's proposals, and there are really three major ones that we need to talk about. One is his proposals directly relating to the real estate market, and the second is two other proposals that are not directly related to real estate, but will impact the market significantly. So first, the one that will impact real estate directly is Trump's proposals on deregulation in general. Trump is in favor of deregulating the market in general. And when it comes to real estate specifically, he's proposed reducing or outright eliminating some federal regulations. And some examples of this could be changing or reducing zoning laws and what is or is not permitted in certain areas, as well as changing where environmental impact reports need to be filed or raising the threshold at which they need to be filed. Now, according to the National Association of Home Builders, about 1/4 of the cost to build a house has to do with governmental red tape and bureaucracy. Regulations account for a whopping 23.8% of the cost to build a residential home. So while deregulation in this instance doesn't affect the building costs directly, it does affect the red tape surrounding building a home, which means that if this does take effect, it could significantly lower the cost to build a home based on permits and regulations. Now, of course, a major question is whether Trump will follow through with this and if it's even possible to pass this, either at the federal level or without resistance from individual states. But since Trump's stance on these things tend to lean in the favor of deregulation, any sort of deregulation, even if it's minor, will have a positive effect if you're a home buyer. Now, if you are a homeowner, this might have a negative effect because it might bring down home prices. The next thing that Trump has proposed is utilizing federal land to build more homes. The US government owns 28% of all the land in this country. So theoretically, if even a fraction of this is opened for new home development, it might lower home prices. With that said, land in this country really isn't scarce to begin with. The major problem really is more so that in city centers and heavily urbanized areas, the population density is already so tight that it's hard to add housing units because you really can only build up. But in areas with lots of land, for example, in Texas, you do see that land already being utilized to build new homes. So one, is Trump actually going to be able to get this passed through Congress? I'm not sure. And secondly, I'm not sure if the positives outweigh the negatives because a lot of federally protected land has to do with protecting the environment. So in this instance, in my opinion, while theoretically more land, which means more homes, means a lowering in home prices, I'm not sure if that actually would happen because land really isn't so much the problem. It's population density in very urbanized areas. And in areas that have land available, you're already seeing that land being utilized, for example, in the outskirts of Houston and Dallas and Austin. Okay, now let's talk about the policy proposals that Trump has suggested that don't directly affect real estate, but can affect it just as much, indirectly. And the first of these policy proposals is immigration, or really deportation. Trump is very staunch on immigration policy, and he wants to deport millions of immigrants. Now, he, along with his inner circle, has floated the idea that this will bring down home prices, because if you have less people trying to buy a home, that means you have less demand. So even if supply doesn't change, if you bring down demand, thus prices will lower. But when you look into the data, it's not that simple. First and foremost, immigrants make a very small portion of the home buying population. That's just a fact. But what they do make a huge percentage of, according to the National Association of Home Builders, is labor. Immigrants make up about 30% of home building labor, which means that if you remove a large portion of that labor force, you're going to get increased costs, because if you have less people available to build homes, that means that you have a constriction of supply. And if the opposing force, which is lower demand, doesn't counter that constricting supply, you're going to get higher home prices. And in my opinion, that's the more likely outcome, simply because immigrants do not make a huge portion of home buyers, but they do make a huge portion of the labor. Now, I want to be as unbiased as possible, so to give him credit, this may affect the rental market because you'll have a lower demand for rental units, but when it comes to home prices, I think that this will be a net negative if we're talking about lowering or decreasing home prices. Okay, another one of Trump's major policy proposals is lower taxes. And again, we can argue all day if his tax proposals really are going to benefit the rich or the middle class. But the fact of the matter is, lower taxes means more money in people's pockets. And don't get me wrong, I don't like taxes myself, but when it comes to a supply and demand dynamic, it's simple. If you put more money in people's pockets, they might use that money, either A, of the middle class, to buy their first home, or to at least add to their savings for their down payment. And if they're the rich, well, guess what? The rich don't like to keep their money in cash. So they're going to want to invest that money. In a previous video, I talked about how this will help the stock market, but the rich might also invest that money in a second home or an investment property, which will, in a sense, add demand. And more demand for the same amount of supply means higher prices. Now, with that said, I want to go over a few of these tax proposals, because if Trump follows through with them and they are passed through Congress, it is going to put more disposable income in people's pockets. So here are a few of his proposals. He wants to increase the child tax credit from $2,000 to $5,000. He also wants to exempt tips and overtime pay from taxes. He also wants to eliminate income tax from Social Security. Right now, about 50% of Social Security recipients are taxed to some level. On top of that, there's been talk on either side about the capital gains tax. Democrats wanted to increase this tax rate, mostly for high earners. Trump wants to make the capital gains rate under his Tax Cut and Jobs Act permanent. Trump also wants to make exempt the income from firefighters, military personnel, and police officers. And he also wants to lower the corporate tax rate from 21% to 20%. All in all, this is a known thing. Republicans tend to want to cut taxes and Democrats tend to want to raise taxes. But this video is on real estate. So what are the likely implications when it comes to that industry? Well, real estate is heavily influenced by supply and demand. And don't get me wrong, I don't like taxes. But simply put, if you put more money in people's pockets, regardless of whether it's the very, very upper class or if it's the middle class, more money in people's pockets means more disposable income. But it also means more income available to either save for a down payment, or if, in the case of the wealthy, it's more income to invest. And some of that investment might go to real estate. So in my opinion, again, all else being equal, because we have to look at these as single variables, this will likely increase home prices. Okay, now let's talk about general real estate trends, because here there's actually a glimmer of hope. According to a new study by Realtor.com, housing inventory is actually expected to increase by a large amount 11.7% in 2025. And on top of that, new builds for single-family homes is also expected to increase by 13.8%. So while 2025 won't be the most balanced real estate market we've had in history, it's looking like it actually might be the most balanced real estate market we've had at least for a couple of years. And really, when it comes to home prices, it comes down to supply and demand. And when it comes to Trump, he does favor deregulation. So we'll have to see if these policies add more supply or add more demand. And when you take all of this into account, before we talk about mortgage rates, I think that 2025 will see a slight increase in home prices on average nationally. And that really stems to the fact that we are just so underbuilt. Some of these policy changes will help us get more supply, but some of these policy changes will also add demand. So until we get that number, which is 2.5 million all the way to upwards of 7 million housing units short, until we make a dent in that, we're going to see either stable or slightly increasing house costs. Okay, now let's talk about mortgages, because this is the other side of the equation. You can have super expensive houses, but if you have low mortgages, you might be in the same place as having cheap housing with very expensive mortgages. But unfortunately here, I don't think we're going to get much relief. At one point earlier this year, mortgage rates were expected to drop significantly in 2025. But now they're forecasted more to average around 6.3%, which is down. The average in 2023 was 6.7%, but they're way above the historical norm, which tends to hover around 4%. Now, why is this happening? The Federal Reserve is cutting interest rates. In fact, they have a meeting in like a week or two, and they're most likely going to cut their federal funds rate by 0.25%. Well, it's happening because, yes, the federal funds rate, known as the FFR, does influence short-term borrowing costs. But mortgages and mortgage rates are much more heavily influenced by the 10-year Treasury, which is a government bond. So until we see noticeable changes in that, we're going to see higher mortgage rates. And here's the kicker to all of this. Even if we saw a significant reduction in mortgage rates, let's say in a best case scenario, we see sub 4% mortgages in 2025, which is not going to happen. But let's say it did. Well, this is going to spur more demand. And it's estimated that for every percentage point drop in mortgages, somewhere between 1 and 5 million new potential home buyers can afford the median priced home. So again, lower mortgage rates is going to cause more demand. With that said though, lower rates in general should make it easier for builders to build because their borrowing costs for construction loans should go down. But in this area as well, I do think that there's going to be more demand spurred by lowering rates than there is more supply. So in conclusion, what do I think is going to happen in the 2025 housing market under the new president? Well, I think it's going to be more of the same, which is slight increases. We're not going to see the dramatic increases that we saw in 2021 and 2022 and in 2023, but we are going to see increases nationally. Now, there are going to be pockets, like, for example, the South, where there is a ton of new builds happening that we might actually see decreases. And in the rental market, we might actually see decreases as well. There are some forecasts that rents have kind of reached their peak. But when it comes to home prices, which is what most home buyers want to know, or potential home buyers, I think it's going to be a slight increase, and I think it's going to be in line with forecasts, somewhere between 3 and 4% for the year. So I hope this video was informative, and I know sometimes economic news isn't happy, but I'd rather tell you how it is than try to sugarcoat it. And the fact of the matter is right now, the real estate market is still severely underbuilt, and until that changes, we're not going to get a massive housing correction or a housing crash. With that said, if you like personal finance, world economics, and investing broken down simply, you are in the right place, so I hope to see you for the next weekly video. Until then, hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.